This morning, Ed McFadden told me that since I've had 2 weeks to work on this sermon, it better be the best one I've ever preached. And I told him I'd already considered that fact and felt somewhat nervous about it. So, change can be a wonderful thing. Change can open us up to the movement of God's Spirit in our lives. It can open us up to God's calling us to new and different places, open us up to new and different ideas in ways that can be more difficult for us to hear in times of life that seem more calm or more static. Change can prepare us for what new is yet coming into our lives and coming into the world. Change can open our hearts and our minds to the leading of God's Spirit and to the voices of one another. Change can be a wonderful thing. And yet, it's also true that change can be scary. Change can be fearsome. And that's just part of our human experience. That's just part of the human reality, that we are creatures who get comfortable with the way that things are, and when we change, when things change around us or we are asked to change, it can evoke a whole host of emotions in us. It can evoke emotions of fear, worry, anxiety, sorrow. We can feel anxious when confronted with change. We can feel sorrowful as we think about what we are letting go of, even as we feel hopeful, anticipating that which is yet to be. Change can evoke a lot of emotions in us, and that's just the reality of it. It's just the way that we're wired. And the truth is, there's a place for all those emotions in our lives. There's a place for fear, worry, even anxiety. They don't have to be only negative. They play a role in our lives. They play a role that can even be positive when we can keep them in balance, when we can listen to our bodies and listen to ourselves and get a sense of where those feelings are coming from. You know, if you think about it, anxiety, kept under control, kept in balance, can also be the thing that helps us to meet deadlines, get work done, follow up with somebody that we owe an email to, check all the ingredients before you feed your nut-allergic child something to eat, or whatever your specific situation is. That's mine. But anxiety doesn't necessarily have to be bad. It asks us to check in with ourselves, to get a sense of where we are in our bodies and in our lives, and then to make adjustments accordingly. And fear can work just the same way. In truth, fear, when it's regulated, also serves an important purpose in our lives. Fear helps to keep us safe. Fear can be the thing that keeps us from running out in front of cars, touching hot stoves. Fear is the thing that kept our ancestors from chasing bears or mountain lions. It's actually the thing that probably keeps us from chasing bears and mountain lions as well. So, the trick with fear and worry and anxiety is to keep them in check. It's when they begin to rise too high, when we begin to get overwhelmed by them, when they start to make us feel stuck, burdened, overwhelmed, instead of being able to function and just be the things that help to keep us moving forward or keep us safe, that's when they can become overwhelming and a burden. That's when it's time for us to employ other tools, to figure out what it is that we can use to bring those emotions back down to a healthy level. When fear, worry, and anxiety start to be the things that are driving the bus for us, when they're in control of us, instead of us being in control of them, that's when it's time for us to look for some different tools. That's when it's time for us to turn to the stories of our faith, to scriptures that can help us to be enlightened or to be moved or to learn something new, a new word from God. Or a time that we can turn to music or to song. A time that we can turn to yoga or meditation. Or a time that we can turn to just being still, peaceful, and quiet. or a time that we can turn to making a to-do list and getting good work done, or gathering together in groups, small or large, to just talk about what we're feeling or experiencing. Or we can turn to the practice of taking time just to be. Or we can come together in a gym with a giant ball and hit it around with a bunch of other people. It's whatever works for you. In those moments, we all have our own tools that we can employ to be able to begin to bring those emotions that change can raise in us back under control, so that they are part of us, but they are not controlling us. And as part of that toolbox that we have, we can turn to stories of those who have walked this human journey before us, stories of the way that they have made their way, navigated their way through difficult moments, moments of change and transition, for inspiration. Stories from the scriptures of people who have navigated their way through moments of change and transition. But whatever it is that works for you, whatever it is that helps to ground you in, as Paul says in his letter, the peace of God that surpasses all understanding. Those are the tools in your toolbox that you can employ when confronted with those moments of change, fear, anxiety, and transition. Those are the things that we can bring out of our toolbox when we are seeking the reminder of that unending truth. When we're seeking to be reminded of the fact that in the midst of change, in the midst of everything, in the midst of every moment of our lives, our loving God can still be found. I think that Paul and those early Christians to whom Paul wrote that letter, the letter to the church in Philippi, here's a map of the early Christian community of Philippi, that letter that Kent read a part of earlier today, I think that's a community, those are people who really would have understood what this church is feeling right now. The moments of transition that we experience and that we are experiencing, having just recently said goodbye to our longtime friend and minister, Beth Lowhead, and moving towards what is yet to be for us on our journey. And I think those early Christians in Philippi would have understood how Christian churches in America feel generally in this day and age, as we consider a changing religious landscape, lives that are fuller than ever, Sundays that are fuller than ever, a time of transition for our whole community. And I think that those early Christians in Philippi would have understood the feelings of anybody in this room who has ever stood at a crossroads and not been entirely sure which way to go next, or of anybody who has ever felt sorrowful at a goodbye, at a moment of transition or change. And the reason that I think that they would have understood that is because the early Christian church, this early Christian community in Philippi, in truth, all of the early Christian communities, they were living those experiences every day. The early Christian church existed in a constant state of transition, change, and growth from the very moments of Jesus' death and resurrection to the establishment of those early Christian communities, to their striving to find their way, to navigate their way, to grow in a community, in a time and in a world where the communities in which these early Christian churches found themselves situated were largely ambivalent about them at best and hostile to them at worst. These early Christian churches found themselves in a place of transition. They found themselves in a place of change. And particularly the early Christians in Philippi, I think, would have understood what it is to be in those kind of moments, because they, specifically, when we hear this letter that Kent read from, they were sitting with the reality that their beloved and trusted friend and leader, Paul, who they really had valued and really respected, was now writing to them from far away, in prison. He had been imprisoned for teaching and preaching the good news of this young faith. And on top of that, They were sitting with the reality that a member of their own community, Epaphroditus, who had been sent with gifts to supply Paul's needs in prison, had fallen ill upon his arrival to Paul. And so they were worried for their friend, their community member. Happily, at least for the early church in Philippi, the reason that we have the letter to the Philippians is because Epaphroditus recovered enough that Paul thought it was time for him to be able to go back, that it was okay for him to go back to Philippi, and he went back with this letter from Paul in his hands, or parts of it. Scholars actually believe that the letter to the Philippians is comprised of several smaller fragments of letters, but be that as it may, we have this letter written by Paul to this early Christian community. And I think what Paul has to offer them is instructive for us as well. Hear these first words that Paul offers them. He says to them, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. Do not worry about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds." Paul writes to this early church that he knows is in the midst of transition and change and worry and fear, and he says to them, rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord. Again, I say rejoice. And then he tells them, and also, don't worry. Don't worry about anything. So when I read this, and maybe this is your thought too, when I read this, what I want to say to Paul is, that's easier said than done. There's so much to worry about. But I think when we can put that truth of our human condition out on the table, when we can acknowledge that our human selves, our human minds tend to want to creep into that worried place, just be honest with ourselves about that, then we can make space too for what Paul has to offer, what Paul is teaching. And I think that Paul has sort of four suggestions, four antidotes to the fear that he thinks that this church might be feeling. This is what I hear Paul saying in that passage. Rejoice in the Lord. Rejoice in your heart. Be gentle with one another. Stay grounded in your commitment to being a community. Allow God's peace to fill your very soul. Those are the 4 points that I pull from what Paul is writing. And those 4 pieces of wisdom, those 4 antidotes to fear, I think they speak to us now as much as they spoke to that early church. They speak to us as a church community. They speak to us as a broader community. Rejoice in the Lord. Rejoice in your heart. Be gentle with one another. Stay grounded in our commitment to being a community. Allow God's peace to fill your very soul. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose life and teaching and ministry, whose dream that our country might move together from a time of difficulty and transition in civil rights and in racial justice and equity, we celebrated last week, whose life and teaching we remember. He also had a sermon that he preached that was about antidotes to fear. He understood the importance when people are facing momentous moments of transition and change, or even those little moments that come into all of our lives, of being able to understand our emotions, recognize that fear enters into our lives, acknowledge it, but not be hindered by it. And he preached a sermon that was entitled Antidotes for Fear. And he also had 4 things, 4 antidotes that he believed were important in confronting and empowering us to move through times of fear. Not to erase our fears, but to move through them. So he had 4 points. The first was acknowledgement and awareness. We know that things make us anxious, he said. We know that things make us afraid. Acknowledge that. Ask yourself honestly, what is it that I'm afraid of? What's that feeling inside of me? Listen honestly to your answer. Be aware of what is driving us. And then he said we need courage. We need courage. We need the courage to be able to even acknowledge to ourselves the fear. The first step takes courage. The power of our minds, he said, that's our courage. Being able to use our mind then to move one step forward at a time. And for Dr. King, every single step we take is a step of courage. And every single step exercises that muscle, making us more courageous for the next step. So even, he said, taking the step of being able to say out loud to yourself or to someone else what it is that you are afraid of, or that worries you, or is troubling you, that's a step of courage. And it builds our courageous spirit to take the next step. His third antidote to fear is love. For Dr. King, so much of division, worry, anxiety, and hate are rooted in our fears. And so he said in this sermon that every time that we feel unequal to a task, that we feel judged by another person, that we feel less than in someone else's eyes, that we feel hesitant or overly anxious, those fears left unchecked can give rise to uglier feelings. And so instead, he said, even in the face of what troubles you, choose love. Choose love. Every choice for love that we make causes fear to lose power. And finally, the fourth antidote to fear is faith. For Dr. King, faith is a transforming power. He said, faith has the power to transform the troubling whirlwind of fear and anxiety into a reviving breeze of hope. Faith has the power to transform our whirlwinds of anxiety into a reviving breeze of hope. You know, those four antidotes to fear that Dr. King offered remind me of what we heard in Paul's letter to the Philippians. Rejoice in the Lord. Rejoice in our hearts. Be gentle with one another. Stay grounded in our commitment to being a community. Allow God's peace to fill your very soul. It occurs to me that many of us probably know stories about Dr. King, and that's right and good, but I wonder how many of us know the story of Audrey Faye Hendricks. Audrey Faye Hendricks was the youngest known participant in the Birmingham Children's March in 1963. And because of that, she is also the youngest known person to be jailed for her participation in the civil rights movement. Audrey was 8 in 3rd grade in 1963 when she made the decision to participate in the Children's March. But really, truthfully, as an adult, when she was interviewed, she said, I was part of the movement, as my parents called it, my whole life. I don't remember a moment that I wasn't. Her parents would take her to mass meetings at their church, meetings to strategize, plan, and talk about what next steps could be taken in the civil rights movement. Her parents and her faith community were extremely active in the movement. And Audrey was just 3, but vividly remembered Christmas night 1956, when the home of Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, a local minister and close family friend, was bombed by segregationists. She said, I don't remember a time in my whole child's life where I wasn't part of the movement. I knew it was important to my parents, to my faith community, to my wider community, and I knew our God was with us. And so when Audrey was 8 and heard that the plans in the movement were for children to march in the hopes that seeing children taking to the streets, children being jeered and taunted, children having fire hoses turned on them, children being attacked by police dogs, would force our country to take a deep inner look at its soul and at its very self. Ask our country to ask who it was, who we are. She said, I want to march. And her parents said, okay. Imagine the bravery on the part of not only Audrey, but those parents. And so Audrey, 8 years old, joined that line of children, and they set off singing. They were singing, "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around." They were singing loudly. They sang as they marched. They sang as they had hoses turned on them. They sang as people taunted them and jeered them. They sang as the police turned the dogs on them, and they sang as they were taken to jail. Asked as an adult what it was that gave her the strength as an 8-year-old child, the strength and the conviction and the courage to march, the strength to sustain her as an 8-year-old alone in that jail, Audrey said, "I knew that my God was with me. My faith got me through. I knew that my parents were behind me. I knew my faith community was behind me. I knew my larger community was behind me, and I never doubted that God was with me." Audrey found her faith in the midst of her fear, and it helped her be sustained in a most difficult time. Audrey and those other children found a faith that compelled them forward, that kept them singing, even in the face of incredibly difficult moments, of incredible hate and division. Rejoice in the Lord. Rejoice in our hearts. Be gentle with one another. Stay grounded in our commitment to being a community and allow God's peace to fill your very soul. That other scripture that we heard this morning, that very brief passage from the book of Joel, it reminds us in no uncertain terms that God's Spirit is for everyone. There is no one left out. God's Spirit pours down upon all people. God's Spirit pours down upon everyone, granting us new dreams, new visions, new ideas, new hope for the future, the ability in every single person to prophesy, to share hopes, dreams, and convictions. God's Spirit pours down on all people. God's Spirit is here in this place, in all of you. God's Spirit is here in this place in your hopes for the future. God's Spirit is here in this place in your courage and conviction. God's Spirit is here in this place in you. God's Spirit was with Dr. King in those difficult moments and in the good moments. God's Spirit was with Audrey Faye Hendricks and those children as they marched and as they sang. God's Spirit was with those early Christians in Philippi, and God's Spirit is here in this place, in you. There is one more word that Paul offered to those early Christians that I think speaks to us as well. Hear these words. Paul closes saying, "Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence or if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing the things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you." In other words, keep being you. Do the things that you know to do. Do acts of goodness and kindness. Follow the teachings of your faith. Keep being you. God's Spirit is here in this place. God's Spirit is here in you. God's Spirit is with us in all things. And with that truth to guard our hearts, how can we keep from singing? Amen.